Tonight, dear listener, we embark on a solemn journey through history's darkest chapters. Wars have carved borders, toppled dynasties, and scarred generations, leaving behind more than ruins of stone, but the quiet echoes of millions of lives lost. We will not dwell on tactics or politics, nor glorify the clash of armies. Instead, we will walk softly through some of the most devastating conflicts humanity has ever known, seeking not triumph, but understanding, the human cost, the silent aftermath, the stories too vast for any single history book. Our path begins in ancient China, in an age when emperors fell and kingdoms rose on the shoulders of soldiers. Then, as smoke clears from those battlefields, we will carry our footsteps forward, century by century, through rebellion, conquest, and global warfare. Each chapter is a window into a world aflame. The thunder of hooves, the rattle of armor, the hush that follows when fields lie empty and villages lie in ruin. Let the day's noise drift away. Imagine a lantern-lit chamber. On a low table sits an open scroll, its inked characters telling of broken walls and shattered hopes. Outside, the night air is cool and still, and each breath reminds us, history did not happen merely on battlefields. It happened in homes, fields, markets, in the tender lives of farmers and scholars, mothers and children. So, gentle traveller, ease into your cushion. Picture distant drums fading into memory. Hear the rustle of bamboo scrolls unwinding as we turn to our first story. A war that fractured a once-united empire into 3 warring realms and left a death toll measured not just in swords, but in famine, disease, and civil collapse. The Han dynasty had ruled China for over 4 centuries, its emperors presiding over vast territories from the Yellow River in the north to the fertile plains of the Yangtze in the south. Yet by the late 2nd century CE, corruption within the imperial court had hollowed out the center, eunuchs and ambitious ministers plotting in shadowed corridors. When the imperial censor Zhang Jia protested these abuses, his removal sparked widespread outrage. Peasant uprisings swelled into full rebellion, and by 184 CE, the once mighty Han court could no longer hold the realm together. In the ensuing power vacuum, generals and warlords carved the empire into 3 rival domains, each claiming the mandate of heaven as justification for its own rule. Wei, under the iron-fisted Cao Cao, who consolidated control over the north and central plains, drawing on a disciplined bureaucracy and a formidable cavalry. Shu, founded by Liu Bei, a distant member of the Han imperial clan, who sought legitimacy through lineage, and the counsel of his trusted strategist, Zhuge Liang. Shu's base lay in the mountainous southwest, the fertile Sichuan basin, where natural defenses turned farms into strongholds. Wu ruled by Sun Quan along the lower Yangtze in the south, whose naval prowess and prosperous river ports gave him an edge in supply and commerce. These 3 kingdoms, Wei in the north, Shu in the west, and Wu in the south, locked China in perpetual war. Armies swept across broken roads, conscripted farmers traded plowshares for spears. Imperial cities were besieged, granaries pillaged, and rural districts razed to deny food and shelter to rival forces. One of the war's most legendary confrontations was the Battle of Red Cliffs in the winter of 208 to 209 CE. Here, the southern alliance of Liu Bei and Sun Quan faced down Cao Cao's staggering numbers. Some contemporary records suggest up to 220,000 troops, though modern historians estimate perhaps 80,000 to 100,000. Regardless of the exact figure, The Northerners vastly outnumbered the Southern coalition. Envision the wide sweep of the Yangtze River, its current swift and cold beneath grey skies. On the northern bank, Cao Cao's massive fleet, rows of flat-bottomed warships tied together to create a floating fortress, lay anchored. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers stood ready, armoured infantry, cavalry hoofbeats echoing on wooden decks, crossbowmen braced behind palisades. Cao Cao intended to press onward, uniting the realm by force. Across the river, the Allied commanders opted for a subtler tactic. Liu Bei's strategist Zhuge Liang spent days studying wind patterns, tides, and Cao Cao's routines. His southern counterpart, Zhou Yu, marshaled a fleet of smaller, more maneuverable ships filled with seasoned sailors, men who understood the river's coves and eddies. At Zhuge Liang's command, small fire rafts, boats loaded with kindling, oil, and flammable reeds, were set alight and sent drifting downstream in the pre-dawn hours. When the wind shifted to the northwest, the rafts bore into Cao Cao's chained armada like a slow fuse. Ladders of flame licked the hulls, wooden decks ignited, sending up plumes of black smoke. Soldiers scrambled, water-laden decks slick with oil hampering their response. The wind-rotted timbers collapsed under heat. At once, the grand flotilla became a lineous pyre. Troops leapt into the freezing river, where many drowned in the darkness, weighed down by armor and despair. In the aftermath, the triumphant southern forces struck. Wu's marines swept along the bank, cutting down stragglers. Shu cavalry advanced inland to take advantage of the rout. Cao Cao, whose ambition had driven him southward, retreated with only a fraction of his army intact. The clash at Red Cliffs became more than a tactical defeat. It marked the irrevocable division of China into three spheres of influence. Yet the Battle of Red Cliffs was only the most famous of countless engagements. Across decades, Wei generals like Sima Yi launched campaigns to reclaim Shu territory. Shu chieftains defended mountain passes at great cost in blood and rice. Wu fleets raided coastal settlements, drawing veteran officers into pitched battles on islands and river deltas. Hundreds of thousands of men perished in pitched battles, but just as many succumbed to starvation and disease as supply lines fractured and refugee populations swelled. Even after the fog of war lifted, when Sima Yan, Sima Yi's grandson, finally reunited the realm under the Jin dynasty in 280 CE, the human toll remained etched upon the land. Entire villages lay abandoned, irrigation canals blocked by silt and sediment, ancestral shrines cracked and overgrown. The Three Kingdoms period, with its storied heroics and bitter rivalries, would resonate through Chinese culture for centuries. Centuries later, that era would be immortalized in Romance of the Three Kingdoms, a 14th-century epic weaving history and legend into a tapestry of loyalty, strategy, and sacrifice. Yet, even as poets extolled the valor of Zhuge Liang and Guan Yu, countless unnamed soldiers faded into obscurity. Mothers wept beside empty beds, and farmers returned to fields scarred by hoofprints and the echo of distant trumpet calls. Across its nearly 100-year span, the Three Kingdoms conflict exacted a staggering human toll. Historians estimate between 36 and 40 million lives were lost. Yet only a fraction perished on the battlefield. Armies consumed the grain that once fed peasants. Granaries emptied to provision soldiers, leaving villages to starve. With farmers conscripted or fleeing violence, fields lay fallow. Famines stalked the land as crops rotted in neglected paddies or were burned during scorched earth campaigns. Droughts and floods, common in China's river valleys, only compounded the crisis when dikes went unrepaired and irrigation channels silted up amid the turmoil. Displaced villagers crowded into walled towns and makeshift encampments, where inadequate shelter and sanitation bred disease. Dysentery, typhus, and smallpox swept through communities already weakened by hunger. Malnourished children and the elderly succumbed in droves, often unrecorded beyond a whispered count. Civil administration fractured as warlords prioritized conquest over governance. Tax collectors vanished, leaving local officials destitute. Grain tribute systems collapsed under the strain, and rice transported down the Yangtze by boat became a perilous gamble for merchants, subject to raids and shipwrecks. Chroniclers of the age describe scenes of mass graves heaped with uncoffined bodies, of entire families disappearing from lineage registers. The fabric of society tore at every seam, and social order unraveled in the face of relentless hardship. Yet, even amid this devastation, the era left an indelible mark on Chinese culture. Centuries later, the Ming Dynasty writer Luo Guanzhong wove the tumult of the Three Kingdoms into his masterpiece, Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Blending historical chronicle with saga and moral allegory, he transformed generals and strategists into legendary figures: Cao Cao, the ruthless tactician; Liu Bei, the virtuous scion; Sun Quan, the pragmatic ruler; Zhuge Liang, the near-mythic sleeping dragon, whose ingenuity burned as brightly as any battlefield flame. Romance of the Three Kingdoms did more than retell events. It codified them into parables of loyalty, wisdom, and honor. Its famous maxim, "When heaven is about to confer a great favor on a man, it first tests his mind with suffering," echoed the era's hardships and offered philosophical reflection on human resilience. The novel's vivid dialogue, dramatic set pieces, and psychological depth captivated readers. Over time, it became one of China's 4 great classical novels, studied by scholars, adapted into operas, stage plays, television series, and video games. The epic's influence extended into military treatises and leadership studies. Zhuge Liang's empty fort strategy, the borrowing arrows with straw boats ruse, and other tactical anecdotes entered the lexicon of Chinese strategic thought, cited by generals in later dynasties and even by modern business leaders. In rural classrooms, students recited its passages to learn rhetoric and moral lessons. In urban tea houses, performers reenacted its duels and debates. Through Romance of the Three Kingdoms, the memory of those millions lost gains, shape, and meaning. The personal tragedies, starving families, orphaned children, displaced peasants, become part of a larger narrative about human aspiration and folly. What began as a struggle for power evolved into a story of courage and conscience that transcended its bloody origins. And so, as you drift into sleep, consider how even the darkest chapter of human violence can be reframed through art. From ash and ruin sprang stories that illuminated the human condition, stories that remind us of both the depth of our suffering and the heights of our ingenuity. In remembering those who perished, we also honor the creativity born from survival, ensuring that the lessons of the past continue to guide us toward a more compassionate future. It was the height of the Tang dynasty's glory. Poets like Li Bai and Du Fu penned verses that sang of rivers shimmering under moonlight. Courtiers in Chang'an then the largest city in the world, strolled grand boulevards lined with flowering trees. Emissaries from Korea, Persia, and even Byzantium mingled beneath silk-draped pavilions. The year was 755 CE, and the realm had known nearly a century of relative peace, prosperity, and cultural efflorescence. Yet in this gilded age simmered the embers of mistrust and ambition. Among the Tang's most trusted generals was An Lushan, a fearsome commander of Sogdian and Turkic descent. Appointed military governor of 3 frontier provinces, he controlled a formidable army of cavalry and infantry stationed along the Silk Road corridors. An Lushan's loyalty once seemed unshakable. He had quashed border raids, expanded Tang influence westward, and even introduced Central Asian customs into court life, earning both admiration and envy. But as his power grew, so did court intrigues. Eunuchs and ministers whispered that An plotted to supplant the emperor. The general, cunning, charismatic, and ruthless, cultivated his own network of officers and officials, promising them land and plunder in return for loyalty. In December of 755, he seized his moment. With swift betrayal, An Lushan's troops swept south from Fanyang, present-day Beijing, overwhelming unprepared Tang garrisons. He proclaimed himself emperor of a new Yan dynasty and marched on the imperial capital. Thus began 8 years of unrelenting civil war. Imagine the streets of Chang'an, once echoing with the click of jade ornaments and laughter from lantern-lit tea-houses, descending into chaos. Imperial guards hastily manned the city walls. Frightened families piled their belongings onto carts, fleeing in columns down the Silk Road. Dust hung heavy in the air, mingled with the smoke of burning markets. The An Lushan rebels breached the eastern gates, their banners snapping in December's chill wind. Over the next months, armies clashed in brutal engagements across Henan and Shanxi provinces. Tang loyalists, led by generals like Guo Zi and the emperor's own brother, Li Chu, rallied to stem the tide. Yet An's forces, seasoned by frontier skirmishes, wielded ferocity unmatched in the dynasty's memory. Villages were sacked, harvest stores looted, civilians conscripted or massacred to terrorize any who might withhold support. Corpses littered fields and roads, their bodies unburied, until scavengers and stench forced survivors to hurriedly dig mass graves. The rebellion's brutality extended beyond open battle. An Lushan's successor, his son An Qingshu, tortured captured officials in palace basements. Local governors turned on each other, siding with rebels or Tang forces in hopes of preserving their fiefs. Meanwhile, famine stalked the countryside. Fields lay untilled as peasants fled conscription or hid amid forested hills. Monsoon rains swelled rivers, washing away toppled granaries. Droughts followed, cracking parched earth. Where once jade-green rice paddies rippled under summer sun, now lay brown-grey mud, broken by furrows left unplanted. Amid these horrors, a glimmer of resilience emerged. Scholar-official Wang Wei, sheltering poets and scribes in a temple near the Qi River, composed elegiac verses on lacquered tablets, lamenting the world in shambles, the people like drifting leaves. Buddhist monks tended the wounded, using rudimentary herbal remedies to staunch bleeding, a practice that tempered despair, if only briefly. Empress Yang Guifei's loyal troops guarded palace gates, sacrificing their lives to protect the imperial family's escape south. By 757 CE, Tang forces, bolstered by Uyghur cavalry from the northern steppes, recaptured Chang'an and later Luoyang, forcing An Lushan's rebellion to fracture under its own weight. Yet the war dragged on for years, with rebel pockets holding out in Liangzhou and the Yellow River Basin. When the final stronghold fell in 763 CE, the dynasty, once at the pinnacle of power, lay irreparably weakened. The emperor returned to a capital shorn of its former grandeur. Court revenues had plummeted, provincial taxes failed to fill empty coffers, and border defenses sagged under the strain. In the wake of the An Lushan rebellion, China endured perhaps the deadliest civil conflict in world history up to that time. Conservative estimates place the death toll between 13 and 36 million souls, soldiers and civilians alike, most of them victims of famine, plague, and the breakdown of civil administration rather than the sword alone. Entire counties vanished from tax registers, family lineages were severed when only a handful survived to recall ancestral names. And yet, the An Lushan rebellion also reshaped China's cultural and political landscape. It spurred reforms in military oversight, emperor and ministers wary of entrusting too much power to frontier commanders. Poets like Du Fu memorialized the suffering, their verses echoing through dynasties to come. In Buddhist and Taoist monasteries, new rituals arose to pray for the dead, weaving personal grief into communal rites. Across the 8 years of conflict, the human cost of the An Lushan rebellion was catastrophic. Modern scholars estimate that between 13 and 36 million people perished, an extraordinary range reflecting both battlefield casualties and the staggering numbers who died off the field. Unlike wars fought primarily between professional armies, this was a conflict in which civilians bore the brunt of suffering. Towns and villages caught between Tang loyalists and rebel forces experienced mass executions, forced conscriptions, and brutal reprisals. Starvation stalked the hinterlands as granaries were pillaged or destroyed to deny food to the enemy. In besieged cities, cramped refugees became breeding grounds for disease. Typhoid, dysentery, and smallpox swept through the malnourished, while makeshift hospitals overflowed with the wounded and dying. When floods washed away rice paddies or droughts parched the Yellow River Basin, the resulting famine claimed lives as indiscriminately as the sword itself. The rebellion's aftermath left the Tang dynasty irrevocably weakened. Imperial revenues collapsed as tax registers went blank, counties wiped from the map in both record and reality. Local administrations broke down, leaving warlords and bandits to carve their own territories from the chaos. The central government, once the bastion of culture and bureaucracy, struggled to reassert control. Frontier defenses along the Silk Roads were thinned, inviting renewed incursions. Millions of displaced people wandered the empire, seeking shelter in distant provinces or foreign lands, an exodus that reshaped demographic patterns for centuries. Social cohesion frayed as families fractured and communities dissolved under the weight of loss. Though the Tang court endured for another century, it never again regained its former brilliance. The Golden Age's promise of harmony gave way to a more fragile era, forever marked by the shadow of An Lushan's revolt. In 1206, a once fractious group of nomadic tribes on the Eurasian steppe coalesced under the banner of a single leader. Temujin proclaimed Genghis Khan oceanic ruler. From that moment, his armies swept outward with a ferocity and speed unmatched in history. By harnessing the unparalleled mobility of mounted archers, the Mongols poured across Asia and into Europe, toppling established empires and reshaping the world. Their campaigns began with the conquest of the Tangut Kingdom in northwestern China and the subjugation of the Jin dynasty in the northeast. Mongol cavalry, light, fast and lethal, encircled walled cities, their composite bows raining arrows in disciplined volleys. Siege engineers, often recruited from conquered peoples, constructed catapults and trebuchets that battered once impregnable fortifications. When walls cracked and gatehouses collapsed, infantry poured through the breaches, leaving cities like Zhongxing and Kaifeng devastated in a matter of weeks. Beyond China, Genghis Khan turned westward to punish the Khwarezm Empire for murdering his envoys. His generals, Jebe and Subutai, led lightning raids across Central Asia, routing armies 10 times their size. Cities such as Bukhara and Samarkand fell after brief, horrifying sieges. Inhabitants who resisted were massacred, libraries and mosques gutted by fire. Estimates place the Mongol death toll from these early campaigns in the millions, as grain stores were burned to deny supplies to both soldiers and civilians, triggering waves of famine among the very populations the invaders claimed to liberate. After Genghis's death in 1227, his successors pressed on, dividing the empire into khanates while maintaining a shared vision of expansion. Under Ugadai Khan, armies poured into Eastern Europe in 1241, shattering the feudal levies of Hungary and Poland at Legnica and Mohi. The thunder of Mongol horse hooves and the roar of their siege engines echoed from the Carpathians to the Adriatic. Even the armored knights of Europe found themselves outmaneuvered by the steppe tactics of feigned retreats and coordinated arrow storms. In the Middle East, Hulagu Khan, another grandson of Genghis, sacked Baghdad in 1258, ending the Abbasid Caliphate. He razed minarets and libraries, and the Tigris ran black with ink from destroyed manuscripts. The collective toll from these campaigns ranks among history's highest. Modern scholars estimate that the Mongol conquests may have claimed between 40 and 60 million lives, both soldiers and civilians, through a combination of slaughter, starvation, and disease. Yet for all their brutality, the Mongols were also ruthless innovators and unifiers. Under Kublai Khan, they completed the conquest of China, founding the Yuan dynasty and establishing a capital at Khanbalik, modern Beijing. They codified a system of relay stations, the Yam, where mounted couriers carried messages and goods across vast distances at unparalleled speed. Tributary states sent silk, silver, and exotic goods to the Mongol court, while artisans, scholars, and engineers traveled freely along the Pax Mongolica, Mongol peace, which stretched from Vienna to the Yellow Sea. Merchants traversed the Silk Road under imperial protection so long as they paid quotas. Caravans numbered in the hundreds, laden with Chinese porcelains, Persian textiles, and spices from India. Ideas traveled with them. Paper-making techniques spread to the West, while Islamic astronomy and mathematics enriched Chinese courts. Diplomatic missions crisscrossed the empire, and envoys from Rome to Tokyo sought audience with the Great Khan. This era of connectivity fostered an unprecedented exchange of culture and commerce, but it rested on the memory of Mongol wrath. Cities that surrendered were often spared. Those that resisted were razed. The same composite bows that unleashed arrows in war became symbols of imperial authority, while the blueprint of mobile cavalry formations influenced armies for centuries. In Europe, the fear of Mongol invasion lingered long after the Khanates fractured into successor states. In Asia, the legacy of unified rule under a single sovereign inspired later dynasties. Tonight, as you rest, imagine the thunder of hooves on endless grasslands, the flash of arrow fletching in dawn light, and the wooden timbers of once proud cities collapsing under battering rams. Picture frontier towns transformed into cosmopolitan hubs, where Persian merchants bartered Chinese silks for Byzantine gold, all under the watchful eyes of Mongol commanders on horseback. Reflect on how an empire born of ruthless conquest also wove together distant lands into a fragile but world-changing network of trade and ideas. Sleep now, held by the paradox of the Mongol legacy, that from unparalleled savagery emerged a fleeting peace that bound continents and cultures as never before. In the mid-19th century, China found itself under the rule of the Qing dynasty, an imperial house of Manchu origin that had weathered external pressures from Western powers, yet struggled to maintain internal stability. Corruption soaked through the provincial bureaucracy. Peasant uprisings flared in the countryside. Opium's grip on society fractured communities and drained the treasury. It was into this tinderbox that a village schoolteacher named Hong Xiuquan thrust himself, and in doing so ignited one of the bloodiest civil wars in human history. Hong was born in 1814 in a modest Hakka family in Guangdong province. After multiple failures at the civil service examinations, he suffered a series of feverish visions in which a heavenly Father told him he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, sent to cleanse the world of demons and establish a heavenly kingdom of peace. Convinced of his divine mandate, Hong proclaimed a new order, one that promised equality, communal landholding, and an end to the Qing foreign dynasty, which he denounced as tyrannical. By December 1850, Hong gathered adherents under the banner of the Taiping, meaning Great Peace. His army of zealots, young men and women drawn from disaffected peasants, miners, and disenfranchised scholars, marched northward, wielding wooden rifle copies and short spears encrusted with revolutionary fervor. With Hong's teachings blending Christian rhetoric, millenarian prophecy, and radical social reform, the Taiping movement offered hope to those crushed under heavy taxation and landlord extortion. Picture the Taiping Standard, simple red characters on a field of white, proclaiming the arrival of a new era. As they advanced, villages rose in support, local magistrates melted away, and Qing forces reeled in confusion. By March 1853, the Taiping army reached the outskirts of Nanjing, a city of jade walls and willow-lined canals that had once served as the Ming capital. After a fierce siege, they stormed the gates, and Hong established Nanjing as the heavenly capital, renaming it Tianjing. Within the walls, Hong's followers set about realizing the vision of the heavenly kingdom of peace. Property was redistributed, communal kitchens and workshops opened, traditional Confucian temples were shut, replaced by churches where vernacular hymns were sung. Men and women were granted equal status in many aspects, straightforward in doctrine but utterly revolutionary in China's deeply hierarchical society. Even foot binding was banned among Taiping women. Yet beneath the utopian veneer lay fault lines. Discipline in the Taiping ranks was draconian. Dissenters faced execution or mutilation. Rivalries among Hong's lieutenants, most notably between his two brothers, Hong Rengan and Yang Xiuqing, festered into deadly intrigue. As the movement consolidated control over a swath of the lower Yangtze, Qing commanders, aided by Western-trained, ever-victorious army units under officers like Frederick Townsend Ward and Charles Gordon, began to push back. From 1854 onward, the conflict escalated into grueling sieges and pitched battles. The Qing deployed tens of thousands of Manchu bannermen and Han Chinese bannermen, often resorting to ruthless, scorched-earth tactics. Crops were burned, wells poisoned, and fleeing civilians shot. The Taiping, in turn, mounted surprise raids on supply lines, cutting off grain convoys to starve out government garrisons. Meanwhile, ordinary people suffered beyond measure. As farming regions oscillated between Taiping and Qing control, harvests were left to rot or destroyed entirely. Starvation became endemic. Cholera, smallpox, and dysentery spread like wildfire among refugee camps and sacked towns. Children grew gaunt in the shade of ruined pagodas, their cries lost in the din of distant cannon. By some estimates, the Taiping Rebellion claimed between 20 and 30 million lives, most of them civilians caught in the crossfire of ideology and power. By 1864, the Qing government, now buoyed by foreign military advisors and modern weaponry, unleashed a final campaign against Tianjin. After a brutal siege lasting months, imperial troops breached the city walls. In the ensuing chaos, Hong Xiuquan's health, already weakened by illness and despair, declined rapidly. He died in June 1864, his body interred in a hastily dug grave beneath Tianjin's shattered canals. His lieutenants, betrayed by internecine rivalries, were captured and executed. The last embers of the heavenly kingdom flickered out. Though the rebellion failed to overthrow the Qing, it left an indelible mark on China's collective memory. The Taiping experiments in land reform and gender equality prefigured debates that would re-emerge in the 20th century. The scale of the carnage demonstrated the vulnerability of the imperial state and exposed the need for modernization, sparking reform movements among Qing officials and intellectuals alike. The Taiping Uprising stands as one of the deadliest civil wars in human history, with estimated casualties soaring between 20 and 30 million souls, mostly civilians caught in a maelstrom of ideology and desperation. In the formative years, Hong Xiuquan's heavenly kingdom of great peace promised radical equality. Land held in common, women freed from foot-binding, and the dismantling of the Qing foreign dynasty. Under his divine mandate, peasants and disaffected scholars rallied behind red banners scrawled with heavenly edicts, marching northward to seize Nanjing and transform it into Tianjin, the heavenly capital. But the rebellion's egalitarian vision quickly curdled into unsparing brutality. As Taiping armies pressed onward, Qing defenders resorted to scorched earth tactics. Rice paddies were sabotaged, wells poisoned, villages burned to the ground. Refugees streamed from the wreckage, their gaunt faces hollowed by hunger. In besieged cities, grain stores ran dry. Families crawled across streets in search of morsels, only to find walls torn down and granaries emptied. Starvation claimed more lives than the sword, and malnourished children and the elderly fell prey to cholera, typhoid, and dysentery in overcrowded camps. Even the communal kitchens and makeshift hospitals the Taiping established in captured territories were overwhelmed by waves of wounded and sick. Medical care, provided by monks and local healers, could not stem the tide of epidemics. Bodies piled in alleys and canals. Sometimes entire neighborhoods were cordoned off to contain outbreaks, leaving survivors to bury their dead in hastily dug mass graves. Within the walls of Tianjin, Hong's regime attempted to codify its utopian ideals. An authoritarian clergy enforced strict moral codes. Personal property was abolished, and every citizen's work and rations were meticulously recorded. Traditional practices, ancestor worship, Confucian rites were banned, replaced by prayers to Hong's scriptures. Men and women served side by side in military drills, church services, and communal labor. Foot binding was outlawed. In theory, the Heavenly Kingdom represented a sweeping social experiment. In practice, dissent was crushed with vicious efficiency. Dissenters, real or perceived, were publicly flogged, mutilated, or executed. Rivalries among Taiping leaders erupted into purges. Thousands of officers and administrators were slaughtered in night-long orgies of suspicion. Power struggles between Hong's trusted generals and his own brothers left the inner circle bloodied and unstable. Behind the grand proclamations of peace and equality lay fear and retribution. By the late 1850s, Qing forces, bolstered by foreign-trained, ever-victorious armies under commanders like Frederick Townsend Ward and Charles Gordon, mounted a relentless counter-offensive. They retook key river crossings, severed supply lines, and hammered Taiping strongholds with modern artillery. Each siege deepened the civilian toll. Farmland was razed to deny resources, and civilians trapped within walls waited in vain for relief. Reports from the Yangtze Delta describe scenes of parents forced to sell their children for rice and towns where only the elderly survived the winter's chill. In 1864, after a prolonged and brutal siege of Tianjin, Qing troops breached the city's defenses. The fall of the heavenly capital was swift and merciless. Hong Xiuquan, weakened by illness and despair, died in secret. His lieutenants were hunted through the ruins, many beheaded in public squares. Survivors, numbering only in the tens of thousands, were rounded up for execution or sold into slavery. In a few short hours, the grand theocratic dream that had promised peace was extinguished in rivers of blood. The rebellion's collapse did not restore prosperity. It left China politically fractured and economically ravaged. Provincial tax records lay in tatters as administrators fled or perished. Refugees, estimated in the millions, wandered the countryside, destitute and unprotected. With the Qing court's resources drained, foreign powers extracted further concessions. Indemnities, trade privileges, and territorial leases, leaving a national humiliation that would fuel reformist currents in the decades to come. Yet the Taiping Rebellion's legacy endured beyond its ruin. Its experiments in land redistribution and gender policy echoed through China's revolutionary movements of the 20th century, inspiring activists who sought to remake society on newer egalitarian lines. Poets and intellectuals turned to Du Fu's elegies and local chronicles to grapple with the human cost, forging a cultural memory that acknowledged both suffering and the yearning for a just world. As you close your eyes tonight, imagine the damp morning air hanging over shattered canal barges, the distant call of scavenging crows in fields once lush with rice, and the faint whisper of hymns to a heavenly Father who disappeared in the smoke of rebellion. Remember that the Taiping Rebellion was not merely a war of armies, but a crucible where millenarian faith, social dreams, and state power collided, leaving a legacy of both visionary zeal and unparalleled tragedy. sleep now, cradled by remembrance, and let these somber truths guide us toward deeper empathy for those who dared to dream and succumbed to history's fury. At the dawn of the 19th century, Europe still trembled from the aftershocks of revolution. France, having overthrown its monarchy in 1789, staggered through years of terror and instability. Into this void stepped a young artillery officer of Corsican birth, Napoleon Bonaparte, whose audacious coup in 1799 installed him as first consul and soon after emperor. With iron resolve and breathtaking speed, Napoleon reshaped French society, codifying laws, modernizing administration, and forging a disciplined army whose loyalty to him was absolute. In 1703, war with Britain resumed after a brief peace, and soon all of Europe stood arrayed against the French juggernaut. What began as a conflict born of disrupted trade and colonial rivalries escalated into a near-continental conflagration. Armies moved like living rivers across Europe, carrying banners emblazoned with the golden eagle of France. From the sun-scorched sands of Egypt to the icy forests of Russia, soldiers marched in tight columns, their boots thudding on cobblestones and dirt roads alike. Napoleon's strategic genius revealed itself most vividly in campaigns of rapid maneuver. In 1705, at Austerlitz, his Grande Armée, numbering roughly 73,000 men, deceived a combined Austro-Russian force nearly double its size. Under grey winter skies, French infantry feigned weakness on the right flank, drawing enemy columns into a trap. At the appointed hour, Imperial Guard regiments stormed the Pratzen Heights, shattering Allied lines in a blaze of musket fire. The frozen ponds along the battlefield glimmered red as fleeing cavalry slipped on ice and bullets found their mark. Austerlitz became Napoleon's masterpiece, a victory so complete that the Austrian emperor sued for peace and the Holy Roman Empire was dissolved. Yet victory in one theatre did not guarantee triumph elsewhere. In 1798, while still first consul, Napoleon led an expedition to Egypt, pursuing British interests in the eastern Mediterranean. His army, 50,000 strong, landed near Alexandria under blazing sun. They clashed with Mamluk cavalry in the dunes outside Cairo, their swords flashing against the desert horizon. Though the Battle of the Pyramids secured French control of Lower Egypt, the fleet was later destroyed by Admiral Nelson at the Battle of the Nile, stranding the expedition and forcing a fighting withdrawal that left morale battered. Back in Europe, Spain and Portugal drew the Grande Armée into a grinding guerrilla war. Cities like Madrid and Zaragoza were besieged, their stone walls defaced by cannon shot, their streets echoing with cries of wounded civilians. French soldiers patrolled olive groves and vineyards, ever watchful for ambushes by Spanish partisans, men and women who struck at supply convoys before vanishing into mountain passes. The peninsula became a Spanish ulcer, devouring French resources and morale over a decade of attritional fighting. Perhaps the most fateful turn came in 1812, when Napoleon crossed the Niemen River into Russia with over 600,000 men drawn from 20 different nations. Summer fields gave way to autumn rain, soaking uniforms and turning roads into quagmires. Supply lines stretched thin. Foraging parties brought back bare baskets. At Borodino, a village ablaze with smoke and cannon fire, French and Russian armies fought in a day of horror, tens of thousands killed or wounded on each side. When Napoleon entered a deserted Moscow amid smouldering ruins, he found no peace treaty awaiting him, only the city's grand palaces consumed by fire. The retreat from Moscow became legendary in its suffering. Temperatures plummeted, frostbiting exposed flesh. Snow piled across roads abandoned by baggage trains, horses collapsed under strain. Russian cavalry harried the remnants of the Grande Armée, picking off stragglers. Only a few tens of thousands emerged alive from the Russian winter. By 1813, the Sixth Coalition, Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, and others, rallied against a weakened France. Under dark autumn skies at Leipzig, later dubbed the Battle of Nations, some 600,000 soldiers clashed in Europe's largest engagement to date. Columns of infantry waded through swirling mist. Cavalry charges crashed against formed squares. Artillery pounded the fields until they lay carved with trenches and strewn with debris. France suffered a decisive defeat and was pushed back toward its own frontiers. Finally, in 1814, Allied forces marched into Paris. Napoleon abdicated and was exiled to Elba, only to return in 1815 for his final bid at power, the 100 Days. At Waterloo that June, under a leaden sky, his 72,000 men faced Wellington's Allied army and Blücher's Prussians. Mud clung to cannon wheels, infantry advanced through knee-deep slush. When the final Imperial Guard broke and fled, the Napoleonic era came to a close. Across all theatres, from Egypt's dunes to Spain's mountains, Russia's forests to Belgium's fields, the Napoleonic Wars claimed between 3.5 and 6.5 million lives, soldiers and civilians alike. They redrew Europe's map, abolished feudal privileges, and spread ideas of legal equality and nationalism across the continent. The Congress of Vienna sought to restore balance, but the spectre of modern warfare in vast armies had been unleashed. Tonight, as you rest, imagine the creak of wagon wheels on muddy roads, the distant boom of cannon fire rolling across fields, and the hush of dawn over frost-coated camps. Remember how deeply one man's ambition reshaped an age, and how the lives of millions, peasant conscripts, artillery crews, siege engineers, and refugee families, were swept into the tide of history. Sleep now, carried by that memory of Europe forged and torn by the fires of the Napoleonic Wars. Across its 12-year span, the Napoleonic Wars claimed an estimated 3.5 to 6.5 million lives. Soldiers felled on battlefields from Austerlitz to Leipzig, and civilians caught in sieges, requisitions, and forced conscriptions. In Spain, whole villages were emptied when French foragers swept through olive groves. In Russia, peasants froze or starved as armies trampled autumn harvests under cannon fire. Disease in crowded military camps, typhus, dysentery, and smallpox added its toll, while urban centers like Moscow and Paris saw civilians' lives upended by occupation, bread shortages, and the constant rumble of marching columns. Yet beyond this terrible cost, the wars ushered in a transformation of Europe's political landscape. Before Napoleon, dynastic rule and feudal privilege defined boundaries more by marriage than by culture. Afterward, the idea of the nation, of people bound by common language, laws, and aspirations, took hold. The Code Napoleon spread notions of legal equality and merit-based administration across conquered territories. Soldiers and civilians alike encountered one another under uniforms that transcended local loyalties, sowing the seeds of a shared identity. When the Congress of Vienna convened in 1814–15 to restore the old order, delegates found they could not simply rewind history. New states and national movements had already begun to flourish. Italian patriots yearned to unite fragmented duchies. German intellectuals spoke of Volk and Heimat beyond princely courts. Polish exiles dreamed of reclaiming their lost kingdom. The Concert of Europe aimed for stability, but in doing so, inadvertently acknowledged that the nation, rather than the sovereign, had become the ultimate source of political legitimacy. So, as you drift toward sleep, remember this paradox of the Napoleonic era. An immense human toll carved out the contours of modern Europe, and from its ashes rose the idea that people themselves, united by culture and conviction, could shape the destiny of their lands. When the smoke cleared on Fort Sumter's ramparts in April 1861, the United States plunged into its bloodiest conflict. At its heart lay irreconcilable differences over slavery, states' rights, and the very meaning of the Union. In the North, the Unionists fought to preserve a federal republic and eventually to end the institution of human bondage. In the South, the Confederacy fought to defend an economy and way of life built on enslaved labor, asserting a vision of sovereign states that could secede at will. From the rolling Blue Ridge foothills to the cotton fields of Mississippi, brothers faced brothers on fields reddened with blood. Volunteers poured into campgrounds, farmers in worn homespun trousers, city clerks in ready-made uniforms, drawing rifles from rail cars or trading plows for muskets. By July 1863, after the cannonade at Gettysburg, where 51,000 men fell in 3 days, it was clear this war would demand staggering sacrifice. Each major battleground bore witness to carnage on an industrial scale. At Antietam, a single September day in 1862 claimed 23,000 casualties, more than any day in U.S. history. Soldiers clung to the high ground at Bloody Lane as wounded men lay where they fell for nights, their groans mingling with the calls of vultures overhead. On the ridges of Shiloh and Chickamauga, artillery shells exploded with ear-splitting concussions, sending steel fragments through ranks of infantry advancing in line. Yet the Civil War was more than open-field engagements. Around Richmond and Vicksburg, Union engineers dug trenches that snaked like scars across the landscape. Siege warfare starved Confederate garrisons into submission. Civilians in besieged towns scavenged roots and boiled leather when the commissary ran dry. Elsewhere, the war took to the rivers. Wooden steamers repurposed as gunboats steamed down the Mississippi, their ironclad sides resisting Confederate shot as they bombarded riverbanks and split the Confederacy in two. Disease claimed even more lives than battle. In cramped camps and makeshift hospitals, measles and dysentery swept through regiments within days. Doctors, armed with little beyond ether and primitive antiseptic, amputated shattered limbs on rolling gurneys, their assistants passing sores and bandages under watchful sentries. In Alexandria and Nashville, convalescent hospitals overflowed with the maimed and fever-stricken. Telegrams carried grim statistics to families back home. By war's end in 1865, the death toll exceeded 600,000 men, more than all other U.S. conflicts combined to that point. Tens of thousands lay missing or unknown, monuments only marking wooded groves where regiments once stood. On Gettysburg's farmland, fields of white marble headstones grew like a forest, each name a testament to a life cut short. The war's outcome redrew the nation's course. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, though limited in immediate effect, transformed the struggle into a moral crusade against slavery. More than 180,000 African American soldiers joined Union ranks, hoping to secure freedom with their bayonets. When General Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse beneath an old oak, his weary troops facing Grant's respectful lines, it signaled not only the Confederacy's collapse, but the promise of a reunited republic. In the aftermath, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments outlawed slavery, guaranteed citizenship, and protected voting rights, radical changes enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. Yet Reconstruction's bitter battles over political power, social integration, and economic justice showed how deep the war's wounds ran. Freedmen's hopes of land and equality met with black codes and vigilante violence. Northern withdrawal from the South ceded the region to segregation for a century more. Throughout the Civil War, battles evolved from massed lines of smoothbore muskets into grueling contests of position and supply. At Petersburg in 1864–65, both armies dug trench networks stretching for miles, zigzagging earthworks bristling with rifle pits and artillery redoubts. Soldiers lived in these muddy ditches for weeks, enduring rain-soaked floors, vermin, and the constant crack of sharpshooters. This entrenchment presaged the static horrors of 20th century warfare, where victory often hinged on the relentless grind of attrition rather than swift maneuver. Complementing these defensive tactics, Union generals like William Tecumseh Sherman pioneered the concept of total war, targeting not only opposing armies but also the economic infrastructure that sustained them. In his infamous March to the Sea, Sherman's forces tore a 50-mile-wide path through Georgia's heartland, destroying railroads, burning warehouses, and uprooting cotton fields. Civilians were compelled to forage or watch their homes and livelihoods go up in flames, while liberated enslaved people followed Union columns, drawing both refuge and a precarious taste of freedom. Meanwhile, the Union's industrial and logistical edge became decisive. Factories in the North churned out Spencer repeating rifles, mass-produced artillery shells, and miles of railroad track. Supply depots, pontoon bridges, and telegraph lines knit distant fronts together, allowing Grant and Sherman to coordinate simultaneous offensives that the Agrarian Confederacy, lacking comparable rail networks and manufacturing capacity, simply could not match. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the conflict lay beyond tactics and technology. Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863 reframed the war as a moral struggle against slavery, inviting African American enlistment and signaling a new social order. By the time Union banners flew over Confederate capitals, the peculiar institution had been irrevocably shattered. The ratification of the 13th Amendment in December 1865 legally abolished slavery throughout the United States, setting the stage for Reconstruction. In this fraught era, federal troops remained in the South to enforce civil rights. Freedmen's bureaus distributed food and education, and newly enfranchised black citizens served in legislatures. Though Reconstruction would falter under political compromise and violent backlash, its constitutional advances, guaranteeing citizenship, equal protection, and voting rights, laid a foundation for future civil rights movements. In the hush that follows the roar of musket and cannon, Remember that the American Civil War forged not only a unified nation, but also redefined the meaning of liberty. The trenches of Petersburg, the scorched fields of Georgia, and the packed hospitals of Gettysburg were crucibles in which modern warfare and social revolution were born. As you drift into sleep, let the echoes of those 600,000 lives illuminate the path from bondage to freedom, and remind us that the true cost of liberty is paid in sacrifice, resilience, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. In the summer of 1914, a single gunshot in Sarajevo set Europe ablaze. Within weeks, alliances dragged nations into a conflict unlike any before, a global convulsion of rivalries, technology, and mass mobilization that would be remembered as the war to end all wars. From the muddy fields of Flanders to the sun-blasted dunes of Mesopotamia, millions of soldiers marched beyond the horizon, confident in swift victory. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a nightmare of trenches, steel, and poison gas. On the Western Front, both sides dug in for a war of position. Miles of trenches zigzagged across northern France and Belgium. Frontline lines, separated by razor wire, shell-pocked no man's land, and the ever-present threat of sniper fire. Soldiers rose at dawn to fetch rations and water, stepping over comrades who lay frozen in hunched positions. Rats larger than cats scurried through dugouts, feeding on unburied remains. Rain turned the muddy ditches into waterlogged prisons. Men stood waist-deep in sludge for days on end, their uniforms rotting against their skin, their boots swallowed by the mire. Beyond bullets and bombs, a new terror emerged: chemical warfare. In April 1915, German forces released chlorine gas at Ypres, its neon green cloud rolling into Allied lines and choking men in their sleep. Gas masks, rudimentary cloth soaked in urine, offered scant protection. Later came phosgene and mustard gas, seeping through trenches to blister lungs and skin, leaving victims blind or unconscious. Medical teams, overwhelmed, struggled to treat burns and respiratory collapse in makeshift aid stations. In one grim exchange, battlefields stained with shell craters became death chambers where wind-borne gas mutated and lingered, forcing entire regiments to abandon positions even without an enemy in sight. On the Eastern Front, the war stretched from the Baltic's frozen coasts to the Carpathian Mountains. Russian infantry, often poorly equipped, launched waves of attacks against Austro-German lines, only to be mowed down by machine gun nests. Cavalry charges, relics of earlier centuries, ended in slaughter beneath barbed wire. Supply shortages and vast distances left soldiers hungry and exhausted, their winter coats torn and threadbare. In the Balkans, Italian and Austro-Hungarian armies suffered in the high Alps, where frostbite claimed as many lives as the rifle. Meanwhile, this truly global war reached far beyond Europe. In the Middle East, British-led forces fought Ottoman defenders in the deserts of Mesopotamia and Palestine, seizing Baghdad and Jerusalem amid dust storms and the crackle of rifles. French and German colonies in Africa and Asia became theatres of skirmishes between colonial troops, while naval battles in the Pacific and Indian Oceans disrupted trade and sent convoys running under grey skies. In the trenches of Gallipoli, Anzac soldiers, Australian and New Zealand forces, landed on Turkish beaches, only to be pinned beneath relentless fire, carving footholds in craggy cliffs at the cost of thousands of lives. Back in Europe, Industrial-scale slaughter was fueled by factories churning out millions of rifles, shells, and gas canisters every month. Women replaced men on assembly lines, forging artillery shells and uniforms in towns where the whistle of steam engines never ceased. Transportation networks, railroads, motor trucks, horse-drawn wagons labored to feed armies numbering in the millions. Telegraph messages crackled between distant headquarters and forward posts, transmitting orders that rippled across continents in hours or even minutes. Amid the carnage, acts of compassion and courage flickered like lanterns in the dark. In December 1914, on the frozen expanse between trenches, German and British troops momentarily laid down arms to share cigarettes, tend to wounded enemies, and bury the dead. Choirs sang carols across no man's land. Footballs bounced between barbed wire under a truce of Christmas. Yet such moments were fleeting. High commands, eager for advantage, swiftly forbade fraternization, and the war's machinery of death resumed its grinding pace. When the United States entered the conflict in April 1917, fresh troops and resources gave the tired Allies renewed strength. In April 1918, British, French, American and Italian forces launched the final offensives along the Western Front, breaking through German lines battered by years of attrition. The 100 Days Offensive rolled back the front lines in a crescendo of coordinated assaults. By November, exhausted mutinies and food shortages crippled the Central Powers. On November 11, 1918, the guns fell silent along a devastated front, and an armistice took effect at the 11th hour of the 11th day. The human toll was staggering: 15 to 20 million dead, including soldiers and civilians, and another 20 million wounded. Entire generations were scarred. Limbless veterans returned to towns where women had learned new trades, where children spoke of fathers who never came home. Europe's great empires, Russian Tsardom, Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy, Ottoman Sultanate, and Imperial Germany, crumbled in the war's aftermath, redrawn into new nations governed by treaties and national aspirations. Across its 4 years of devastation, World War I claimed an estimated 15 to 20 million lives, soldiers and civilians alike swept into the maw of industrial slaughter. In the trenches of Flanders and Picardy, men fell by the thousands in single battles: artillery barrages that shattered bone, machine gun barrages that cut down waves of infantry, and gas attacks that left survivors blind or choking on their own lungs. Beyond the front lines, civilian populations endured siege conditions, food shortages, and aerial bombardment as entire towns were reduced to rubble. Influenza outbreaks, spurred by the movement of troops around the globe, added another grim layer, killing millions in crowded cities and military camps. Yet the human toll was only part of the war's seismic impact. When the armistice finally silenced the guns in November 1918, the map of Europe lay in tatters. 4 great dynasties, the Habsburgs of Austria-Hungary, the Romanovs of Russia, the Hohenzollerns of Germany, and the Ottomans, had collapsed under the strain of conflict, revolution, and social upheaval. In their place, a patchwork of new nation-states emerged: Poland restored after more than a century of partition, Czechoslovakia carved out of Bohemia and Moravia, Yugoslavia uniting South Slavs, and the Baltic republics declaring independence along the shores of the frozen sea. These freshly drawn boundaries, often imposed by the victors at Paris, carried deep contradictions. Ethnic groups found themselves minorities in new countries, Economic centers were severed from their traditional hinterlands. Rivers that once flowed through a single empire now formed international borders. In the Middle East, the breakup of Ottoman domains under Allied mandates sowed the seeds of mandates in Iraq, Syria, and Palestine, territories whose modern struggles trace back to borders drawn hastily on a map. Even where states survived, they did so in a transformed world. Germany, once a rising industrial power, faced punitive reparations and territorial losses that fueled resentment and economic collapse. France regained Alsace-Lorraine, but paid in blood and material ruin. Britain and its dominions shouldered massive debts, their imperial century weakened by the sacrifice of a generation. Across the Atlantic, the United States, yet untested by total war, emerged as a creditor nation and a growing voice in global affairs. Politically, the war shattered faith in the old order. Socialist and worker movements, emboldened by the Russian Revolution of 1917, pressed for expanded suffrage and labor rights. Monarchical and conservative elites, blamed for dragging nations into senseless butchery, lost power or were forced to negotiate with parliaments and trade unions. In the rubble of chateaux and palaces, new constitutions enshrined democratic principles in lands that had known only autocracy. Culturally and psychologically, the lost generation clung to the memories of battlefields and destroyed landscapes. Poets like Wilfred Owen and Guillaume Apollinaire wrote of mud-filled craters and the agonies of shell shock, a term that entered the lexicon as doctors struggled to treat men who could not sleep, who flinched at every sudden noise, whose spirits were shattered long after their bodies had healed. Artists and writers rejected grand narratives of glory, opting instead for stark realism, Dadaist irreverence, or streams of fractured consciousness that mirrored the fragmentation of European societies. In the decades that followed, political currents, fascism, communism, nationalism, drew strength from the bitterness and disillusionment of those who had lived through the war. Economic depression and social unrest provided fertile ground for ideologies promising renewal, retribution, or radical change. Thus, the war to end all wars left a legacy not of lasting peace, but of broken promises and unstable peace treaties. Tonight, as you drift toward rest, imagine the silence that followed the final whistle of gunfire. Battlefields quiet, but for the rustle of grass over shallow graves. Ruined town squares where only scavenging birds now gathered. Shattered towns where survivors picked through the wreckage of their homes. In that hush, a generation stood shell-shocked and uncertain, haunted by the scale of human destruction and the fragility of the world they once knew. World War I redrew maps, toppled dynasties, and left societies reeling. Its lessons of the perils of industrialized conflict, of borders drawn without regard for culture, of the costs borne by civilians, echo through subsequent history. Sleep now with the memory of those millions who did not live to see the peace they fought for, and let their sacrifice remind us of the price of war and the preciousness of the fragile calm that follows. In September 1939, as dawn broke over the Polish countryside, the roar of German panzer divisions shattered the fragile peace Europe had clung to since the last Great War. By war's end in 1945, the globe itself had become the stage for the deadliest conflict in human history, a total war fought across continents, oceans, and skies. From the blitzkrieg lightning strikes that overran Western Europe to island-hopping campaigns in the Pacific, no corner of the world remained untouched by the thunder of cannon or the drone of bombers. At its heart stood two rival coalitions: the Axis, led by Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan, driven by ideologies of racial supremacy, territorial conquest, and autocratic rule, and the Allies, a diverse alliance initially anchored by Britain, France, and China, later joined by the Soviet Union and the United States, united in the desperate struggle to halt aggression and restore self-determination. In Europe, the Nazi war machine surged across Poland, Norway, France, and the Low Countries, employing combined arms formations, armoured spearheads supported by dive bombers and motorised infantry to dislocate Allied defences. Massed artillery barrages reduced cities to rubble, while occupation policies enforced brutal repression. Deportations, forced labour, and summary executions became routine. Meanwhile, in East Asia, Imperial Japan sought to carve out a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, sweeping through China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands. Sailors on aircraft carriers launched airstrikes against coastal cities. Infantry brigades pushed through tropical jungles, often meeting fierce resistance from guerrilla fighters. Prisoners of war endured the Bataan Death March and cramped hell ships, while civilians in occupied territories faced famine, slavery, and medical experiments. Amid these campaigns, a darkness unlike any before descended. The Holocaust, Nazi Germany's state-sponsored genocide that aimed at the complete extermination of European Jewry, along with Roma, Slavs, disabled individuals, political dissidents, and other groups deemed undesirable. Death camps, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, became factories of murder, where rail cars disgorged victims who were processed, gassed, and incinerated in industrial furnaces. Survivors bore scars of starvation, forced labor, and the loss of family and community. On the home fronts, civilian factories roared with activity. In American assembly plants, workers, many of them women, built Liberty ships, Sherman tanks, and B-17 bombers that flew deep into German heartlands. In Britain, air raid sirens wrenched families from sleep, herding them into subway tunnels as the Luftwaffe wrought destruction above in the Blitz. Across the Soviet Union, Moscow and Leningrad endured sieges that tested human endurance. Millions shared scant rations under winter snows and constant shelling. In August 1945, new agents of mass destruction made their debut. At Hiroshima and Nagasaki, American B-29 superfortresses dropped atomic bombs. Little Boy and Fat Man, murderously demonstrating the power of nuclear fission. In an instant, mushroom clouds rose over the cities, vaporizing tens of thousands and unleashing radiation that would claim untold more lives in the months and years to follow. These strikes precipitated Japan's unconditional surrender, ending the war, but at a cost that reshaped moral and strategic calculations for generations. From Europe's frozen steppes to the jungles of Burma, from North Africa's deserts to the skies over Tokyo, World War II spanned every theatre where human conflict could reach. It saw the first large-scale use of radar, long-range rockets, and amphibious assaults. It mobilized entire economies and societies for total war, mandating rationing of food, fuel, and clothing, drafting millions into the armed forces, and compelling civilians to endure blackouts, air raids, and voluntary relocation. 70 to 85 million lives were extinguished in those 6 terrible years. Soldiers cut down on battlefields from the Ardennes to the Marianas, civilians killed in cities leveled by strategic bombing, and countless more lost to starvation, disease, and genocide. In the Soviet Union alone, up to 27 million perished. In China, the Japanese invasion and its atrocities claimed another 15 to 20 million. Air raids on Hamburg, Dresden, Tokyo, and countless industrial centers sent survivors fleeing rubble and firestorms. The Holocaust murdered 6 million Jews, while the atomic blasts at Hiroshima and Nagasaki instantly obliterated over 200,000 lives and irradiated many more. The aftermath of this global cataclysm reshaped the world in every dimension. Politically, empires dissolved and new superpowers emerged. The United States and the Soviet Union locked into a Cold War that would dictate strategy for decades. Technologically, penicillin, jet engines, radar, and nuclear fission vaulted from experimental projects into transformative forces that remade medicine, transportation, and energy. Morally, societies grappled with the horrors of genocide and total war, codifying "never again" into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and establishing tribunals to prosecute crimes against humanity. Borders were redrawn, nation-states reborn, and a fragile United Nations formed to prevent another such conflagration. In the echoes of mass graves and war-scarred cities, humanity learned both the cost of unchecked aggression and the imperative of collective responsibility. In the vast heart of Africa, where the Congo Basin's emerald rainforests cradle the world's second-largest river, an internal conflict spiraled into a regional catastrophe. Beginning in 1996, the Democratic Republic of the Congo became the epicenter of what would come to be called Africa's World War. More than 9 neighboring countries and over 20 distinct militias, rebel factions, and foreign armies took up arms across a landscape scarred by colonial legacies, ethnic tensions, and collapsed governance. It started when Rwandan and Ugandan forces crossed into eastern Congo to pursue those responsible for the 1994 genocide, igniting a proxy war that drew in armies from Angola, Zimbabwe, Namibia, Chad, Sudan, and beyond. Alliances shifted with bewildering speed. Former rebels became government allies. Foreign troops backed one militia one month and its rival the next. In the east, the forests and mountains became a patchwork of armed camps, each group carving out its own territory, taxing villages and battling over mineral-rich enclaves. The scale was staggering. More than 2 million square kilometers of territory saw active combat, ambushes on dirt roads, or aerial strafing by light aircraft. Towns once buzzing with market traders fell under curfew or siege. In Kinshasa and Lubumbashi, refugees poured in along overburdened highways, bringing tales of mass forced recruitment, looted homes, and forests laced with landmines. Humanitarians who ventured beyond the capital reported convoys stopped at militia checkpoints where fighters demanded taxes in the form of food, fuel, or young recruits. This was not a war of front lines, but of attrition, where the most lethal weapons were not only guns and shells, but hunger, disease, and displacement. Entire communities were uprooted as villagers fled through dense undergrowth, clutching children and scarce possessions, seeking safety in camps that mushroomed near border towns. Aid agencies struggled to deliver food and medicine across pothole-pocked roads, negotiating safe passage with commanders whose rivalries often determined whether aid trucks passed or turned back empty. Underneath the cacophony of gunfire lay motives as complex as the region's history. Rebel groups fought for control of gold and coltan-laden hillsides. Foreign armies defended their own security interests or sought to influence Kinshasa's government. Ethnic militias exacted revenge for massacres decades old, while local strongmen exploited chaos to expand clandestine mining operations. As these tangled agendas clashed, civilians found themselves caught in a vortex of violence where the very soil beneath their feet could be weaponized. Through dense jungle and across rivers swollen by seasonal rains, international observers documented patterns of brutality. Villages razed to deny potential recruits, children conscripted to carry ammunition or serve as porters, women and girls subjected to systematic sexual violence. Courts in The Hague would later call the Congo Wars a widespread and systematic campaign against civilians, yet justice remained elusive in the smouldering ruins of bombed-out towns. Despite sporadic peace treaties and transitional governments, the conflict raged on for more than 7 years. It ebbed and flowed with political shifts in Kinshasa, with power struggles among rebel coalitions, and with the arrival or departure of foreign forces. In the capitals of Pretoria, Harare, Kampala, and Kigali, diplomats convened and walked away, leaving the fighting to continue. Meanwhile, Congolese families eked out life amid the crossfire, cultivating small plots in the margins of battle, sharing meager rations with neighbors, and praying for an end to a war that had swallowed half a decade of their youth. Despite claiming little attention in global headlines, the Congo Wars rank among the deadliest conflicts since the Cold War's end, its sheer scale of human suffering rivaling the bloodiest wars of the 20th century. International focus remained fixed on hotspots like the Balkans, the Gulf, and Afghanistan. Yet in eastern DRC, the fragmentation of state authority allowed militias and foreign armies to wage a sustained campaign of violence against civilians. Journalists who did manage to reach remote villages returned with harrowing accounts of forced labor, mass rape, and child soldiers. But their stories rarely broke through the international news cycle, overshadowed by crises in Europe and the Middle East. This near silence in global media only deepened the tragedy. Aid convoys, already constrained by treacherous roads and bureaucratic hurdles, found their appeals drowned out by more visible disasters. Refugee camps swelled unnoticed. Mortality rates from preventable diseases climbed. Malnutrition, once a rural scourge, spread into urban peripheries. International NGOs warned of a silent genocide, but without sustained coverage, donor fatigue set in. As world attention drifted elsewhere, the militias exploited the vacuum. They traded mineral resources for small arms, reinforcing their capacity to terrorize villages and ambush relief convoys. The wars also upended regional dynamics, dragging neighboring states into a vortex of violence and political intrigue. Uganda and Rwanda deployed troops ostensibly to pursue genocidaires. Angola and Zimbabwe intervened to support Kinshasa's government. Sudan and Chad lent tacit backing to rebel factions, each driven by security concerns and economic opportunism. Borders blurred as militias crossed rivers and mountain passes, creating transnational corridors of lawlessness. This tangled web of alliances and enmities ensured that the conflict could not be neatly contained within Congo's borders. Any peace agreement required buy-in from multiple capitals, an almost impossible diplomatic feat. Today, the echoes of those wars still resonate across the Congo basin. Although large-scale combat operations subsided after 2003, pockets of armed groups continue to clash, often over control of timber, gold, and coltan deposits critical to the global electronics industry. In North Kivu and Ituri provinces, militias carry out sporadic attacks on villages, displacing tens of thousands each year. Government forces, sometimes accused of human rights abuses themselves, struggle to assert authority beyond major cities. Meanwhile, international peacekeepers, operating under the United Nations' largest and most expensive mission, face chronic challenges: limited infrastructure, rampant corruption, and the persistent threat of ambush. The ongoing instability has dire consequences for everyday Congolese. Schools in conflict-affected areas close sporadically to avoid violence. Health clinics lack reliable supplies of vaccines and antibiotics. Roads remain impassable for much of the year, isolating communities from markets and basic services. Women and girls remain at high risk of sexual violence, a weapon wielded to intimidate and punish. Economic recovery stalls as foreign investors shy away from regions perceived as insecure, perpetuating cycles of poverty that fuel recruitment into rebel ranks. Yet amid the hardship, Congolese civil society and local peace builders work tirelessly to rebuild trust and foster dialogue. Grassroots initiatives train former combatants in agriculture. Women's groups mediate land disputes. Youth collect discarded landmines to repurpose into art. These efforts, though underreported, offer glimmers of hope that sustainable peace may one day take root. As you reflect tonight, let your thoughts drift over the vast rivers and forested hills of the DRC, regions that once bore the full fury of Africa's World War and still echo with its unresolved conflicts. Remember that even in a world saturated with crises, human suffering can go unnoticed, and that true healing requires both global awareness and sustained local commitment. Sleep now, holding close the courage of those who press on toward peace in the shadows of forgotten wars. In September 1980, at dawn's grey edge along the Shatt al-Arab waterway, Iraqi tanks rumbled across the marsh-lined banks into Iran's Khuzestan province. What followed was 8 years of brutal stalemate, a war born of simmering territorial disputes over river boundaries and of revolutionary zeal released by Iran's 1979 Islamic Revolution. Initially, Saddam Hussein hoped for a quick victory, believing Iran's newly established government vulnerable and isolated. Instead, both sides settled into a grinding conflict that would redefine modern Middle Eastern warfare. From the outset, the front lines hardened into static defenses reminiscent of World War I. Iraqi engineers laid miles of trenches, reinforced by barbed wire and earthworks, while Iranian forces, driven by revolutionary fervor, dug in along ridges and date palm groves. Every advance was measured in yards. Infantrymen slogged through muddy craters, rifle butts chafed palms, and bayonets gleamed in the harsh sunlight as soldiers clung to every bunker and sap. Night after night, probing raids tested defenses. Artillery barrages rained over no man's land, turning desert soil into blown-out moonscapes. As the war ground on, both armies reached for ever more devastating weapons. Iraq, seeking to break Iranian resolve, deployed chemical agents, mustard gas and nerve agents, to blind, blister and suffocate defenders in their dugouts. Wind changes sometimes blew these gases back over Iraqi lines, sowing terror among those ordering their use. Iranian paramedics, often volunteers with minimal training, struggled to treat skin burns, lung damage, and neurological symptoms in field hospitals littered with empty gas masks and blood-soaked bandages. In response, Iran adopted mass, sometimes fanatical, human wave assaults. Revolutionary Guards and Basij volunteers, many barely trained and driven by religious conviction, were ordered to charge Iraqi defenses en masse, often carrying nothing more than bayonets and slogans painted on cloth. Under a hail of machine gun fire and artillery, these waves of volunteers surged toward barbed wire, their lines thinning with each volley. Survivors clambered over no man's land to press against enemy trenches, only to be repelled by coordinated counterattacks. Each assault cost thousands of lives, imprinting the desert sand with echoes of courage and desperation. Trench networks crisscrossed the flatlands from Khuzestan to the mountains of northern Iran. Supply convoys, black Mercedes-Benz trucks in the Iraqi case, dust-soaked pickup trucks in Iran's, maneuvered under constant threat of ambush and airstrikes. Engineers laid minefields in front of defensive lines. Tanks prowled behind them, their turret guns poised to blast any breakthrough attempt. Helicopters hovered above, inserting commando teams into enemy rear areas under cover of strobe-flashed flares, only to be met by runaway sandstorms that grounded rotary wing reinforcements. Civilians found themselves ensnared in the war's lethal grip. Border towns like Khorramshahr and Basra changed hands repeatedly, their markets leveled, mosques damaged, and populations decimated. Residents huddled beneath makeshift shelters, drinking brackish well water tainted by artillery shell runoff. Hospitals overflowed with concussed soldiers and burned civilians, while power outages left wards lit by flickering candlelight. Every evening, the horizon glowed with fires from bombed-out districts as artillery lanes carved the night sky. Despite early hopes on both sides for a decisive breakthrough, the front lines scarcely shifted over 8 years. Each offensive, whether Iraq's armored thrusts or Iran's volunteer charges, ended in bloodied retreats and stalemate. Peace talks stalled over territorial claims to the Shatt al-Arab, over wartime reparations, and over political recognition of Iran's revolutionary government. When a tentative ceasefire finally held in 1988, neither nation had achieved its objectives. Over 1 million lives were extinguished in those 8 years of attrition. Soldiers cut down by artillery fire, civilians suffocated in gassed trenches, villagers trapped where the front lines froze. Yet, despite the appalling human cost, neither Iran nor Iraq secured decisive territorial gains. Battles raged over the same tangled lines of fortifications, the choke points along the Shatt al-Arab waterway, the scrubby hills of the Al-Faw Peninsula, only to end with each side digging in once more. Villages devastated by bombardment lay abandoned, their fields unplanted and their wells contaminated, reminders of a war that yielded nothing but loss. When the ceasefire finally held on August 20th, 1988, soldiers on both sides exchanged weary nods across a demarcation that closely mirrored the original border. Tanks remained parked in the same half-destroyed villages they had first assaulted 8 years earlier. Frontline trenches, once scenes of frenzied human wave charges and chemical attacks, were frozen in mud. Commanders dutifully recorded positions back into war diaries, marking them held until further orders, even as relief swept through war-torn barracks. The stalemate left the Gulf region forever altered. Iraq's economy lay in tatters under the weight of military expenditure and crippling debt to Western creditors, debts amassed to fund the purchase of weapons and pay for reconstruction of shattered towns. Iran, though spared foreign occupation, bore the scars of chemical warfare and widespread destruction in its oil-rich provinces. Reconstruction efforts strained the young revolutionary government, which struggled to balance war reparations with internal demands for social and economic reform. Beyond the borders of the combatants, the war's legacy shaped modern Middle Eastern geopolitics. Gulf monarchies, fearing Iranian revolutionary zeal and emboldened by Western security guarantees, expanded military ties with the United States and Europe. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the smaller Emirates funded Iraqi rebuilding and quietly welcomed American bases on their soil, embedding the U.S. military presence in the region for decades to come. Arms deals skyrocketed as Western and Soviet suppliers seized the opportunity to supply both sides with ever more sophisticated tanks, aircraft, and chemical precursors. Meanwhile, the war's unresolved tensions lingered along the waterway that both nations claimed. Skirmishes over navigation rights flared periodically, drawing international mediation, but no lasting settlement. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps emerged from 8 years of combat as a powerful political and military force, its veterans hardened by trench warfare and chemical assaults, its leadership seasoned in coordinating complex logistics under fire. In Iraq, Saddam Hussein's regime bolstered internal security through brutal purges of suspected dissidents, using the specter of another Iranian invasion to justify pervasive surveillance and repression. The conflict also influenced proxy struggles across the region. Iran sought to export its revolutionary ideology to Shia communities in Lebanon, Bahrain, and southern Iraq, supporting militias that later played defining roles in conflicts ranging from the Lebanese Civil War to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Iraq, in turn, cultivated alliances with secular regimes and minority groups, positioning itself as a bulwark against Tehran's influence. This tug-of-war between Tehran and Baghdad echoed in Damascus, Amman, and Cairo, influencing arms transfers, intelligence operations, and the formation of informal defense pacts. For the Gulf's civilian populations, the war's shadow cast a long silhouette. Oil-rich provinces on both sides, once promising centers of wealth, remained littered with unexploded ordnance and collapsed oil wells. Veterans returned to towns where infrastructure rebuilding lagged behind government budgets, often reliant on foreign contractors whose profits flowed overseas. Displaced families who had fled combat zones found themselves unable to reclaim ancestral lands until mine clearance programs could guarantee safety, programs that moved at a pace measured more by international funding cycles than by on-the-ground needs. As you reflect tonight, imagine the endless lines of supply trucks crawling through desert choke points, the flicker of flares over no man's land as chemical alarms wailed in trench complexes, and the silent rank of headstones in soldiers' cemeteries, each marking a life expended in pursuit of goals that ultimately proved unreachable. Remember that the Iran-Iraq War, though overshadowed by conflicts soon to follow, planted seeds of mistrust and militarization that continue to shape Gulf politics and security calculations today. Sleep now, carrying in your thoughts the lesson that even the fiercest battles may yield no victory, and that the deepest wounds often heal only with the recognition that some lines, once drawn in blood, demand reconciliation rather than conquest. In July of 1937, the world outside China's borders still rattled with the aftershocks of economic depression and diplomatic maneuvering. Yet, in the city of Marco Polo Bridge, just outside Beijing, a skirmish between Japanese garrison troops and Chinese defenders ignited a conflict that would spiral into one of history's deadliest wars, often overshadowed by the broader Second World War, yet in its own right a catastrophe of staggering scale. Imperial Japan, driven by a doctrine of expansion and a hunger for raw materials, had already established a puppet state in Manchuria the year before. But when Japanese forces marched into Chinese suburbs south of the Great Wall, they encountered fierce Chinese resistance, unprepared for full-scale invasion. Within days, northern Hebei province lay under military occupation. Major cities fell in rapid succession as Japanese divisions, advancing under columns of tanks and mechanized infantry, overran rail lines and airfields. Shanghai became the war's first great crucible. From August to November 1937, China's National Revolutionary Army, recently modernized with Soviet advisors and Western armaments, defended the city's bustling streets and tenements. Chinese battalions hurled themselves into counterattacks on fortified Japanese positions. Rifle volleys echoed beneath neon shop signs, while artillery thundered against warships offshore. But Japan's superior air power and naval gunfire support gradually wore down the defenders. Civilian districts became battlegrounds, and refugee crowds fled toward the bund-lined riverbanks, clutching bundles, children on shoulders, eyes wide with fear. Then came the fall of Nanjing, China's ancient capital, on December 13, 1937. Japanese troops poured across the Yangtze and entered the walled city as winter winds stung bare cheeks. What followed in the subsequent weeks would sear itself into collective memory: the Nanjing Massacre. Soldiers fanned out through narrow lanes and grand avenues alike, executing surrendered officers, summarily shooting men in uniform, and dragging civilians, men, women, and children, into courtyards, only to gun them down. Eyewitnesses reported the scale of brutality. Bodies strewn along the Qinhuai River where drownings were staged, mass graves dug in abandoned gardens, and makeshift hospitals torn apart by bayonets. Women sought refuge in temples or foreign consulates, only to be dragged away in pairs and subjected to systematic rape before being killed or left to die. Churches opened their doors to shelter the terrified, but many of the faithful and clergy perished alongside the laity. By its end, the city stood silent beneath its thick winter sky. Smoke rising from smouldering homes, the stench of decay heavy in the air. This atrocity was far from an isolated incident. Across eastern China, along the Yangtze River's banks and amid the cluttered farmland of Anhui and Jiangxi, Japanese patrols enforced scorched earth policies. Villagers were forced from their homes, fields were burned to deny supplies to Chinese forces, livestock was slaughtered en masse. Agricultural cycles collapsed, and rural populations fled into mountainous refuges or urban slums, carrying with them tales of massacre, rape, and forced labor. Japan's military doctrine emphasized swift, overwhelming force to break both armies and civilian morale. Air raids pounded cities like Wuhan and Chongqing. Mitsubishi G-3M bombers dropped incendiaries over civilian neighborhoods, reducing districts to ash. When Chinese capitalists and foreigners attempted to evacuate, Japanese blockades at river crossings and railway stations turned desperate flights into death marches. Refugee columns became targets for artillery, strafing, and summary executions meant to instill terror in those who remained. Meanwhile, China's war effort spread south and west. In Guangzhou, generals organized defensive lines along the Pearl River, hoping to slow the Japanese advance. In the rugged terrain of Yunnan and Guizhou, Chinese troops, backed by American volunteer Flying Tigers, mounted guerrilla campaigns, sabotaging supply convoys and ambushing patrols. But the vastness of China's interior and the scale of Japan's industrial mobilization created a grinding war of attrition. Each fallen city was soon rebuilt as a military base, each retreating regiment replaced by fresh divisions. Despite tremendous bravery and sacrifice, China's nationalist government struggled to coordinate its forces across disconnected theaters. Warlords in the north defended personal fiefdoms rather than the national cause. Communist guerrillas in the northwest alternated cooperation with sporadic clashes against nationalist units. Meanwhile, Japanese planners mapped railway corridors and resource deposits deep into China's heartland, coal mines in Shaanxi, iron deposits in Hebei, preparing for a prolonged campaign to secure the raw materials vital for their war machine. As the conflict deepened, Chinese civilians bore the brunt of suffering. Food shortages became endemic as steel mills and factories were converted to military production, leaving the agricultural sector neglected. Seasonal famines erupted when irrigation canals were destroyed or rice paddies trampled under tank treads. Refugee camps swelled in the shadow of besieged cities, their populations more vulnerable to cholera and starvation than to battlefield explosions. And yet, through all this devastation, China's resolve endured. Patriotic fervor spread in towns as students and intellectuals wrote poems and leaflets urging unity. Underground networks distributed guerrilla manuals and news from the front lines. In Shanghai and Chongqing, foreign journalists documented Japanese atrocities, smuggled photographs and first-hand reports that began to pierce the veil of silence abroad. Over 20 million Chinese soldiers and civilians lost their lives in those brutal 8 years. Countless peasants caught in crossfire, factory workers conscripted and sent to frontline munitions factories, and entire cities depopulated by famine and disease as armies passed through. In the autumn of 1941, when Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor drew the United States into full-scale war, the struggle in China seamlessly became part of the wider Pacific theater. American bombers struck Japanese supply lines that fed armies in central China. Allied convoys delivered trucks and rifles along the treacherous Burma Road. Chinese guerrillas tied down Japanese divisions that might otherwise have been redeployed to the Pacific Islands. Yet even as international forces collided in the Pacific, the memories of atrocities like the Nanjing Massacre and the tortured journeys of refugees escaping the flood of advancing troops remained etched deeply in the Chinese consciousness. In post-war East Asia, those scars shaped geopolitics and culture. Memorial halls sprang up in every province. School children recited poems about fallen heroes, and families carried the trauma of unmarked graves through generations. The Second Sino-Japanese War endures not only as a chapter of World War II, but as a foundational tragedy in East Asian history. Its legacy of loss and resilience continuing to inform regional relations, collective memory, and the shared resolve never to forget. In the early summer of 1618, the streets of Prague simmered with tension. Protestant nobles, furious over Emperor Ferdinand II's interference in their religious practices, hurled two of his envoys from the window of Prague Castle's royal residence, an event that would echo across Europe for 3 decades. What began as a localized clash between Catholics and Protestants in the patchwork realm of the Holy Roman Empire soon exploded into a continent-wide conflagration, drawing in France, Sweden, Spain, and nearly every German principality in a maelstrom of shifting alliances and dynastic ambitions. At its core, the 30 Years' War appeared a sectarian struggle. Protestants defending their right to worship, Catholics determined to restore the Church's authority. Armies raised under the banners of Lutheran princes marched alongside troops loyal to the Catholic Habsburgs. Mercenary regiments composed of Spaniards, Italians, Scots, and Walloons swapped sides for the highest bidder. Yet over time, the conflict's religious veneer gave way to geopolitical calculations. France, a Catholic kingdom, allied with Protestant Sweden to check Habsburg power. The Dutch Republic, still smarting from its own war of independence, furnished ships and funds to Protestant forces. What began as a war of faith became a grand chess game of European statecraft, with victory measured in territory and influence as much as in theological victories. Much of the bloodshed unfolded on German soil. Villages and towns across Bohemia, Saxony, and southwestern Germany found themselves under siege or occupation, their fields trampled by passing armies. Peasant levies, raw recruits pressed into service to defend their landlords, met professional pikemen and cavalry at battles like Breitenfeld and Lützen, where imperial standards waved atop smoke-choked hillsides. Kings and electors conferred in diplomatic salons, even as soldiers looted granaries and forced villagers at sword point to haul siege artillery through muddy roads. But it was not only the sword that waged war. Armies carried home more than trophies. They brought back disease in their tar-soaked tents and famine wherever harvests went untended. Between sieges, soldiers billeted in local homes spread typhus and dysentery. When marauding cavalry razed barns, villagers lost their winter grain and livestock. Chroniclers of the period spoke of entire counties where no man, woman, or child was to be found. The population either slain, driven off, or starved into the earth itself. In the Holy Roman Empire, the human cost was staggering. Modern historians estimate that up to 20% of Germany's population perished as a result of the war, some 6 to 8 million people in total, including combatants and civilians. Towns once bustling with trade fell silent. Trade routes along the Rhine and Danube were disrupted for years. Skilled artisans and merchants fled to safer lands, taking with them the economic vitality that had sustained German cities for centuries. Diplomatic efforts dragged on even as the continent reeled under these twin disasters of battle and famine. The Peace of Westphalia, finally concluded in 1648, did more than end hostilities. It codified a new international order. Sovereignty was enshrined as a principle, granting each state the right to self-determination in religious and political affairs. The era of supranational empires imposing uniform faith and law gave way to a Europe of discrete nation-states, a transformation whose echoes would shape diplomatic norms for centuries. Trench lines and battlefields were only a part of the 30 Years' War's devastation. As armies crisscrossed the countryside, peasants were forced into grisly choices: remain and starve, or flee into forests stripped bare by marauding soldiers. Grain stores, once meant to feed families through winter, were looted or burned. Famine stalked every hamlet. Survivors resorted to boiling roots, bark, or even horsehair to eke out meagre meals. In one recorded episode near Würzburg, villagers ate bark soup for months, collapsing in the streets as their strength failed. Disease followed in the wake of conflict. Typhus, carried by lice that thrived in unwashed uniforms, swept through ill-equipped villages. Dysentery spread among those crowded into hastily dug encampments where latrines overflowed and clean water was scarce. Smallpox flared anew, its pustules marking young and old alike, while malaria struck in marshy regions where draining ditches had been left to silt. Medical knowledge, limited to herbal poultices and rudimentary amputation, could offer little relief, and mortality rates soared. Amid these horrors, whole lands lay depopulated. Mercenary armies, hired by princes and paid in territorial concessions, found little reason to show mercy. Unpaid soldiers turned on civilians to quench their hunger and preserve their plunder. Villages were razed to deny the enemy cover. Churches were stripped of lead roofs to melt down for bullets. Beech forests were clear-cut to fuel lime kilns used in fortification building. What remained of the empire lay desolate, its markets silent and its fields fallow, awaiting years of labor to reclaim even a fraction of what was lost. At last, a weary Europe sought peace. The Treaty of Münster and Osnabrück, collectively the Peace of Westphalia, took shape in 1648 after grueling negotiations involving dozens of states and principalities. It granted rulers the right to determine their territory's religion, Catholic, Lutheran, or Calvinist, ending decades of sectarian strife. It recognized Swiss and Dutch independence, diminished Habsburg hegemony, and enshrined principles that would underpin modern international law: sovereign equality, non-intervention, and a balance of power meant to discourage future continental domination. In reshaping diplomacy, Westphalia marked Europe's emergence from medieval notions of imperial unity into a system of nation-states. Ambassadors established permanent embassies, formal protocols governed treaty ratification, and the concept of legitimacy shifted from dynastic claims to recognition by peers. Though the scars of war lingered for generations, the settlement laid the foundation for a more stable order, an order constructed in the shadow of mass starvation, relentless disease, and battering mercenary armies, yet forged by the conviction that even the deepest divisions could be bridged by diplomacy. As you drift into rest, imagine the hush that fell over those devastated landscapes when the final treaties were signed. The fields, once trampled by hooves and stained by blood, now silent under autumn mist. The town squares, emptied of soldiers, echoing with the hesitant footsteps of returning villagers, and the great halls of Münster and Osnabrück, where weary envoys exchanged pens for relief, and Europe at last exhaled in collective hope. Sleep now. carrying in your heart the promise that even after centuries of conflict, peace can be crafted from the ashes of devastation. By the mid-16th century, France was a nation on the brink. The Protestant Reformation had ignited a religious zeal in Europe, and in France, the Huguenots, French Calvinists, gained converts among nobles, merchants, and artisans. Their emphasis on personal faith and simplified worship clashed with the grandeur of the Catholic Church and the Crown's alliance with Rome. Tensions mounted as Huguenot nobles defended their right to worship and hold office, while Catholic hardliners denounced them as heretics undermining the social order. When the Duke of Guise's troops massacred a band of worshippers at Wassy in March 1562, the first shots of the French wars of religion rang out. Noble families like the Montmorencys and Bourbon aligned with the Huguenots, forming military leagues to protect sanctuary towns, Nimes, La Rochelle, and elsewhere. Meanwhile, the House of Guise and the ultra-Catholic Holy League marshalled their own retainers, declaring war on all rebels and demanding the Crown enforce the Council of Trent's anti-Protestant decrees. For decades, the kingdom fractured along both faith and faction lines. Siege engines thundered against the walls of Protestant strongholds. Cavalry charges cleaved through improvised infantry squares. Between pitched battles, those at Dreux, Jarnac, and Moncontour, ambushes and raids devastated the countryside. Peasants fled burning farmsteads. Rivers ran red with blood as retreating forces slaughtered captive garrisons. Immense cathedrals and humble chapels alike were defaced, statues torn down, stained glass windows smashed, altars lit aflame in symbolic assaults on the rival faith. In 1572, a fragile peace appeared on the horizon. The Crown arranged the marriage of the Protestant Henry of Navarre, future Henry IV, to Margaret of Valois, sister of King Charles IX. Paris's streets teemed with hope as Huguenot nobles arrived to pay homage to their new royal relative. Yet the celebratory mood turned to horror on St. Bartholomew's Day, August 24th, when rumours of a Huguenot plot prompted Catherine de' Medici and the Guises to signal a coordinated strike against Protestant leaders. In a matter of hours, thousands were slain. Guards hunted worshippers in private residences. Townspeople, incited by inflammatory sermons, poured into narrow lanes where victims, men, women, and children, were butchered with knives and swords. The Seine ran with blood as bodies were cast into its currents. The violence spread beyond Paris to provincial towns, where local authorities joined in the slaughter, seizing Huguenot assets and emptying the homes of those who fled into the night. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre reverberated across Europe, chilling Huguenot communities and shocking other Protestant nations. Envoys from London and Geneva recorded letters smudged with tears, recounting how houses still bore the stain of blood at doorways and how families vanished without trace. In the weeks that followed, the Crown issued edicts attempting to restore order, but the bonds of trust had been shattered. Protestant princes renewed their leagues, vowing vengeance. Catholic zealots, emboldened by success, demanded the eradication of heresy. Over the next quarter-century, France was racked by intermittent wars punctuated by uneasy truces. Each side seized the throne's momentary weakness to press its demands. Huguenots defended the right to worship freely, to hold public office, to fortify key towns. Catholics insisted on the kingdom's unity under the one true faith. Armies camped beneath ancient abbeys, and royal proclamations carried warnings of excommunication for contravening religious decrees. Through it all, civilian life unraveled. Farmers abandoned fields deemed too dangerous. Merchants diverted trade to Protestant-friendly ports like La Rochelle, undermining the traditional markets of Tours and Toulouse. Scholars and poets, Ronsard, Du Bellay, penned elegies for what they called this nation of ruins, lamenting the loss of France's cultural heritage to the fanaticism of both camps. By 1598, with the crown weakened by internal strife and foreign threats from Spain, the new King Henry IV, once the Protestant champion, made a historic choice. He embraced Catholicism to win Paris's support, declaring ruefully, "Paris is well worth a mass." He then issued the Edict of Nantes, granting Huguenots the right to practice their faith in specified regions and civil rights equal to Catholics, while reaffirming Catholicism as the state religion. But that pivotal document, and the deeper wounds it sought to heal, belongs to the next chapter of our story. For now, rest with the memory that France's wars of religion began as a conflict of conscience and became a geopolitical nightmare, culminating in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where centuries of cohabitation and coexistence splintered in days of unspeakable horror. Sleep now, held in the hope that from such darkness a fragile peace could eventually take root. Over the 36 years of intermittent war, France suffered an estimated 3 million deaths, soldiers cut down in pitched battles, and civilians crushed by the grinding machinery of sectarian violence and social collapse. Peasant uprisings erupted when local lords exploited weakened royal authority. Outbreaks of famine in the Loire Valley and Languedoc followed scorched earth raids as armies foraged without mercy. Cities like La Rochelle and Lyon endured sieges that left their populations hollowed by hunger and disease before surrender. At last, weary of bloodshed and facing threats from Spain's Habsburgs, King Henry IV forged a pragmatic peace. In April 1598, he promulgated the Edict of Nantes, granting Huguenots freedom to worship in designated areas, access to public office, and fortified places of safety to defend themselves. Catholicism remained the state religion, yet Protestants acquired civil rights unprecedented in early modern Europe. This uneasy bargain, toleration without full equality, held for nearly a century, embodying a fragile coexistence that would later fracture, but at that moment allowed France to rebuild its shattered towns, reopen its markets, and begin the slow recovery from decades of religious war. In the wake of 1917's seismic upheaval, the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II and the Bolshevik seizure of power, Russia fractured into a brutal battleground of ideologies and armies. What began as a revolutionary promise of peace, land, and bread quickly descended into a struggle for the very soul of the former empire. Competing visions clashed across vast steppes and over frozen rivers. On one side, the Red Army, forged by Lenin and Trotsky into a disciplined revolutionary force determined to consolidate Soviet rule. On the other, the White Army, a loose coalition of monarchists, liberal Democrats, Cossack warlords, and foreign interventionists, each driven by their own motives, yet united in opposition to Bolshevism. As winter's chill gripped Petrograd and Moscow in late 1917, small red detachments, workers' militias and peasant recruits, seized rail stations, telegraph offices, and government buildings. Their red banners fluttered over the Winter Palace and the Smolny Institute, symbols of a new order. Yet beyond the major cities, authority remained tenuous. In the Volga region, Admiral Kolchak declared himself supreme ruler of Russia, raising a white army that swept through Siberian towns, buoyed by officers of the old Imperial Guard. Farther south, General Denikin marshaled forces from the Don and Kuban Cossacks, his cavalry raids plunging deep into the grain-rich provinces around Kharkov and Rostov. Meanwhile, in Ukraine and the Baltic lands, nationalist aspirations collided with both Reds and Whites. Ukrainian nationalists formed the Directory, seeking an independent state, only to find themselves squeezed between Bolshevik commissars and white generals suspicious of separatism. In the Caucasus, Armenian and Georgian armies carved out brief years of autonomy amid shifting alliances. Foreign powers, Britain, France, Japan, the United States, sent expeditionary forces to Murmansk, Vladivostok, and Arkhangelsk, ostensibly to safeguard munitions and reopen an eastern front against Germany. Their presence bolstered white armies, but also fueled Bolshevik propaganda about imperialist intervention. The Civil War's front lines were as fluid as they were vast. A Red Brigade might hold Petrograd one day and be redeployed by railway to confront Denikin's forces near Tsaritsyn, later Stalingrad, the next. Trotsky, the newly appointed Commissar for War, personally supervised armored trains bristling with machine guns, racing along spiked rails to reinforce beleaguered Soviet garrisons. Propaganda trains broadcast revolutionary songs and Lenin's speeches to factory workers and peasant villages alike, rallying support for the Soviet cause. In the south, white columns under General Wrangel captured key grain ports along the Black Sea, hoping to starve Bolshevik-held cities. They counted on backing from Allied powers, whose war-weary governments saw in the Whites a bulwark against communism, but also an opportunity to secure business interests and strategic footholds. Yet foreign supplies and advisors proved insufficient to unify the white factions, whose leaders quarreled over strategy and competed for scarce resources. The war's brutality escalated on both sides. Red terror squads, Cheka death detachments, rounded up suspected counter-revolutionaries, often executing them without trial. In towns under white control, reprisals targeted Bolshevik sympathizers and ethnic minorities accused of supporting Soviet rule. Villagers faced double jeopardy. Banded together by local bandits preying on the chaos, they were sometimes forced to supply both armies, only to be suspected of treachery by whichever side held the nearest railway station. Cities like Odessa and Rostov-on-Don alternated between red and white control multiple times in a single year, each shift accompanied by looting, summary executions, and forced conscription. Factories slipped production from wartime munitions to civilian goods and back again, depending on who held the plant gates. In the winter of 1919, a white offensive pushed within 50 miles of Moscow, prompting dire warnings in Soviet newspapers of impending collapse. But timely Red counterattacks, organized under former Tsarist officers who joined the Bolshevik ranks, turned the tide, illustrating the Civil War's ironies, where yesterday's imperial generals became saviors of the revolution. Amid this military cauldron, ordinary Russians were left to navigate a landscape of terror and uncertainty. peasant committees imposed grain requisition quotas, stirring widespread resentment as famine loomed in the countryside. Refugees, nuns, intellectuals, entire village populations fled towards ports that still promised passage abroad, boarding overcrowded ships bound for Constantinople or Marseille. In the Pale of Settlement, Jewish communities faced pogroms from marauding white units and fearful peasants alike, deepening the social fissures that underlay revolutionary fervor. As 1920 dawned, the balance of power shifted decisively in favor of the Red Army. Trotsky's organizational acumen, centralized command, strict discipline, and ruthless suppression of dissent proved more sustainable than the fractured politics of the whites. With peasant support rekindled through promises of land redistribution, and with strategic reserves drawn from industrial centers, Bolshevik forces began reclaiming territory from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Yet for all its eventual outcome, the Russian Civil War left a legacy of devastation, burned villages, shattered industry, and a population wearied by years of conflict. The fratricidal struggle's lessons would shape Soviet governance for decades, justifying the secret police, centralized planning, and ideological vigilance that became hallmarks of the USSR. Tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine the ghostly trains rumbling through snowbound forests, the commissars unrolling maps by lantern light, and the flicker of campfires where soldiers on both sides gathered under a sky empty of stars, each convinced that their cause alone could save Russia from ruin. Sleep now, bearing the memory of a war that tore apart a nation and forged an empire in its ashes. Over the course of the Russian Civil War, at least 7 to 12 million lives were lost, victims of frontline slaughter, summary executions by both Red and White terror units, and the famine that stalked the devastated countryside. Soldiers fell in pitched battles on frozen steppes. Civilians perished when food supplies were seized to feed armies. Entire villages faded from the map as hunger and disease moved in. In Ukraine and the Volga region, peasants whose grain was requisitioned by Red detachments found themselves with nothing to eat, while in Siberia and the Far East, White sympathizers faced reprisals that often ended in mass shootings. This sea of suffering, however, achieved the grim aim of the revolutionaries. It solidified Soviet control under Lenin's leadership. The Red Army's eventual victory proved the effectiveness of centralized command, ideological discipline, and ruthless suppression of dissent, methods that would become cornerstones of the new Soviet state. In the years that followed, the Bolsheviks used the Civil War's emergency powers to nationalize factories, requisition grain under the war communism policy, and crush peasant uprisings like the Kronstadt Rebellion. These measures, harsh though they were, laid the institutional groundwork for the Soviet Union's planned economy and one-party rule. Internationally, the Bolshevik triumph reverberated far beyond Russia's borders. Socialist movements in Europe and beyond drew hope from the success of the world's first workers' state, even as governments in London, Paris, and Washington feared the contagion of communist revolution. Diplomatic relations were suspended or severed. Anti-Bolshevik expeditions, though limited in scope, underscored the West's determination to contain the new regime. Yet, despite sanctions and blockades, the Soviet government endured, cementing a geopolitical divide that would harden into the Cold War. By 1923, when the last pockets of white resistance were extinguished, the Soviet Union had emerged from its crucible transformed. The war's lessons in organization, surveillance, and mobilization shaped party doctrine and carried forward into Stalin's era. The apparatus of repression honed during the Civil War became the Cheka and later the NKVD, institutions that would enforce conformity and fuel political purges. At the same time, the narrative of Red Victory became a central pillar of Soviet identity, commemorated each year with parades and medals awarded to the survivors of the great patriotic war that was the Civil War. Tonight, as you settle into calm, imagine the iron tracks of armored trains winding through ghostly forests, the glow of bonfires where commissars rallied exhausted troops, and the muted sobs of displaced families huddled in makeshift camps along the rails. Reflect on how the crucible of war forged a superpower whose influence would dominate world affairs for the next 70 years, and how the echoes of those millions of lives spent in the struggle still ripple through history. Sleep now, holding in your thoughts both the human cost of revolution and the indelible mark it left on the 20th century. In the early dawn of June 25, 1950, the Korean peninsula, still reeling from the wounds of colonial occupation and civil division, erupted once more in violence. Under cover of darkness, tens of thousands of North Korean troops surged southward across the 38th parallel, their T-34 tanks and infantry columns advancing in shock formation towards Seoul. What followed was neither total victory nor decisive defeat, but a brutal 3-year stalemate that remains unresolved to this day. Technically, the Korean War never ended. It simply paused under the fragile terms of an armistice. From the outset, the conflict embodied the wider rivalry of the early Cold War. North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union's military advisors, tanks and artillery, and later reinforced by millions of Chinese volunteers, saw itself as the vanguard of communist expansion in Asia. Their initial successes stunned the Republic of Korea's poorly equipped forces, pushing them southward in a desperate retreat through the rice fields of Gangwon Province and the coastal plains near Busan. On July 5, 1950, President Harry S. Truman authorized U.S. forces, already stationed in Japan, to intervene under the banner of a United Nations collective security action. Within days, American infantry, armored battalions, and naval task forces bore down on Korea's shores. Their mission to halt the North's advance and restore the Republic of Korea's territorial integrity. By August, the U.S. Eighth Army, alongside British, Canadian, Australian, Turkish, and other UN contingents, funneled through the Pusan perimeter, a tenuous defensive arc that encircled the southeastern tip of the peninsula. As summer gave way to autumn, both sides mobilized resources on an unprecedented scale. Soviet pilots flew MiG-15 jet fighters from hidden airstrips in Manchuria, challenging UN air supremacy over the Yalu River. North Korean infantry divisions, hardened by months of guerrilla training in Chinese villages, probed UN lines with night assaults and infiltration tactics. Chinese People's Volunteer Army battalions crossed the icy Yalu in late 1950, turning UN advances into chaotic withdrawals. Mountain passes and river valleys became killing grounds where frostbite claimed as many lives as bullets. Despite near annihilation at certain points, neither side could achieve a decisive breakthrough after the initial rush. The UN counterattack at Incheon in September 1950, an audacious amphibious landing masterminded by General Douglas MacArthur, reclaimed Seoul, and plunged northward toward the Manchurian border. Yet by November, the massive Chinese intervention rolled back those gains, forcing UN forces into a swing southward that stabilized around the 38th parallel by mid-1951. Seasons cycled rapidly on the peninsula, winters so bitter that artillery frozen in place snapped like brittle branches in Arctic cold. Summers so monsoon wet that trenches turned to rivers of mud. Engineers built pontoon bridges across the swollen Imjin River. Field hospitals struggled to treat frostbite victims and patients suffering from dysentery. Rations of rice and American C-ration tins sustained soldiers on both sides, while Korean porters carried ammunition and water across winding ridgelines under constant threat of artillery bombardment. By 1951, the front lines resembled the static warfare of earlier generations, echoing the trench networks of World War I more than any swift maneuver of the Second World War. Hilltops and ridges, so-called meat grinder positions, changed hands repeatedly as both armies sought tactical advantage. In the air, jet duels between F-86 Sabres and MiG-15s set new precedents for modern aerial combat, drawing spectators at UN commander headquarters who tracked kills with terse telegrams. Through it all, civilians bore the brunt of uncertainty. Millions had fled their homes during each advance and withdrawal, creating waves of internally displaced persons whose towns lay in no man's land. Women and children scavenged burned villages for food and clothing, while South Koreans in Seoul huddled in basements during nightly air raids. North Koreans in Pyongyang faced similar terrors. Red Army units requisitioned rice and forced labor, while Chinese regiments patrolled the streets to enforce discipline and collect donations in kind. In July 1953, after protracted armistice talks at Panmunjom, negotiators finally agreed on a ceasefire line close to the pre-war boundary. Both sides withdrew heavy artillery and exchanged prisoners of war under the gaze of neutral observers. Yet no formal peace treaty was signed. The armistice remains a temporary halt to hostilities rather than a lasting settlement. Demilitarized zone fences, 40 kilometers long and 2 kilometers wide, slice across the peninsula today, guarded by tens of thousands of troops on each side, their helmets reflecting the same iron watchfulness born from decades of unresolved tension. Tonight, as you lower your gaze to this still moment, recall the Korean War's unique fate, a conflict that surged beyond a single nation's borders, invoked the rivalries of global superpowers, and forged military innovations from jet combat to amphibious landings. Remember also how the war's survivors, veterans on both sides, returned to divided homelands, some never seeing family members again, their village cemeteries left for decades untended. Sleep now, holding in your heart the knowledge that peace, once broken, can linger just beyond reach, and that the peninsula's frozen armistice remains a testament to both wartime devastation and the uneasy hope for reconciliation. Over the 3 years of fighting, the Korean peninsula paid a devastating price. An estimated 3 million lives were lost, most of them civilians caught in the crossfire of shifting front lines and scorched earth tactics. Villages along the Imjin and Han rivers emptied as families fled advancing armies, only to find their homes pulverized by artillery when they dared return. Refugee convoys, women and children carrying what little they could on ox carts, were strafed by low-flying aircraft, turning dusty roads into scenes of panic and tragedy. In Seoul, each change of control forced residents to reckon with new dangers. When North Korean forces swept in under the red flag in June 1950, property was requisitioned, suspected dissidents rounded up. When UN troops retook the city in September, reprisals followed against those labeled collaborators. Seoul itself changed hands 4 times over the course of the war, each occupation leaving its own mark on the city's fabric and psyche. One week, streets hummed with the disciplined march of North Korean soldiers delivering revolutionary fervor. The next, American Sherman tanks rumbled down boulevards freshly renamed in English, their tracks gouging asphalt and sending shards of concrete flying. Churches and schools became makeshift hospitals, their stained glass shattered, corridors echoing with the groans of the wounded. Underground shelters, once cramped subway stations, filled nightly with families huddled in the glow of dim lanterns, praying for the dawn that might bring safety or fresh shelling. Beyond the capital, the war's imprint extended across the countryside. Entire villages disappeared where nothing remained but scorched foundations and rusted well pumps. In mountainous regions, narrow valleys known as meat grinders changed hands repeatedly as UN and Chinese forces sought to secure strategic ridge lines. After each assault, fields lay trampled by tanks and pocked with shell craters. Farmers returning after the armistice found the land scarred, irrigation ditches collapsed, and centuries-old cherry orchards reduced to stumps. Ultimately, the 1953 armistice drew a line across the peninsula, roughly mirroring the 38th parallel, but adjusted to reflect tactical realities, creating the demilitarized zone. Barbed wire fences, minefields and watchtowers now slice through forests and rice paddies, a perpetual reminder of a ceasefire that froze the conflict rather than resolved it. Along this Cold War frontier, soldiers stand vigilant, their binoculars trained on the hills across a no-man's land where poppies and wildflowers bloom in spring, a rare, fragile beauty amid instruments of war. Tonight, as you settle into stillness, picture the echoes of artillery fading into silence across that scarred landscape, the rustle of reed grass over empty craters, the distant hum of watchtower generators, and the soft murmur of veterans recalling lost comrades at twilight. Remember that the Korean War's legacy is not only in the tragic toll of 3 million lives, but in the frozen border that remains to this day, a testament to both the horrors of war and the enduring hope that one day rifles will be replaced by shovels and seeds planted where tanks once rumbled. Sleep now, carried by the thought that even amid unresolved conflict, the promise of peace can germinate in the quiet spaces of remembrance. As our journey through history's deadliest conflicts draws to a close, remember that wars rarely end with a flourish of trumpets or a signature on gilded parchment. Their true conclusion comes slowly, in the echo of disrupted lives, in the scars etched upon landscapes, and in the fragile silence that follows gunfire. Fields once churned by cavalry hooves grow quiet, trenches fill with rainwater and collapse into grassland. Cities, rebuilt stone by stone, nevertheless carry the memory of their darkest hours in cracked facades and empty tombstones. Families pass down stories of loss as inheritance, teaching each generation the weight of absence and the price paid for broken peace. Each conflict we've visited, ancient dynastic struggles in China, Europe's religious wars, the global conflagrations of the 20th century, the modern tragedies in Africa and the Middle East, the frozen frontiers of Korea, held more than military tactics or shifting alliances. Behind every death toll lies a mosaic of personal tragedies. A mother searching for a missing child, a farmhand conscripted and never returned, a village emptied of its elders and left to the vines of memory. These human echoes outlast armies and treaties, lingering in lullabies sung beside candle-lit cradles and in the slow, deliberate rituals of remembrance on battle anniversaries. Yet memory also carries warning. When we recount the anguish of famine in the Three Kingdoms or the chemical horror of World War I, we confront the manifold ways that technology and ambition can outpace compassion. When we reflect on the Taiping Rebellion's theocratic fervor or the Spanish atrocity at St. Bartholomew's Day, we see how ideology, no matter how lofty, can curdle into tyranny if it silences dissent and enshrines violence. When we survey the proxy struggles of the Congo Wars and the Syrian Civil War, we recognize how local grievances become catalysts for wider power struggles, how the suffering of civilians can be obscured when global headlines chase the latest flashpoint. Remember, too, that geography itself bears witness. The pockmarked fields of Verdun remain hallowed ground. The blackened ruins of Nanjing's city walls stand as silent sentinels. The barbed wire of the demilitarized zone cleaves a peninsula still awaiting peace. In every forest where battles once raged, in every desert where armies once tramped, nature reclaims the wreckage, but it does not erase it. Remnants of uniforms and weapon fragments lie half-buried among roots, while wildflowers bloom upon graves of unknown soldiers, marking the boundary between memory and oblivion. Through all these echoes, one truth emerges: history does not sleep. It unfolds in the lessons we heed or ignore. The devastation wrought by mechanized warfare in the 20th century prompted calls for arms control and international cooperation, leading to institutions designed to contain future conflicts. The genocidal campaigns of World War II inspired declarations of human rights and the concept of crimes against humanity. The religious reconciliations forced by treaties like the Edict of Nantes and the Peace of Westphalia taught Europe how to bind divergent beliefs under a fragile peace. Even the unresolved ceasefires on the Korean Peninsula and the frozen lines in the Middle East stand as reminders of conflicts awaiting true resolution. And yet, in remembering these tragedies, we also honor resilience. Communities rebuilt after siege and famine. Democratic ideals emerged from autocratic collapse. Survivors became chroniclers, artists, and educators who ensured that the horror of yesterday might inform a better tomorrow. Schools teach these histories so that new generations understand the stakes of political ambition and the human cost of division. Memorials rise worldwide: cenotaphs, museums, plaques, so we might look upon names carved in stone and feel the weight of their sacrifice. Perhaps above all, remembering these wars offers a warning of what not to repeat. When demagogues stoke fear of the other, when economic collapse breeds desperation, and when technology makes destruction swifter and more absolute, we must recall the spectres of the past and choose a different path. Diplomacy, dialogue, and restraint become moral imperatives, as vital as any treaty inked in grand halls. The roars of cannon and the cries of refugees remind us that peace, once broken, exacts a lifelong debt, but also that peace, once rebuilt, can shelter the seeds of hope. Now, dear listener, as you drift into slumber, carry with you the hushed lessons of these centuries of conflict. Let the silence of rain on quiet fields and the sigh of wind through abandoned trenches soothe your thoughts. May the memory of those who endured remind us all, residents of a shared planet, that the promise of tomorrow rests on the choices we make today, to honor the fallen by guarding the fragile calm they aspired to, and to shape a future where history's harshest chapters remain only as cautionary tales, never as blueprints for fresh tragedy. Good night, and may these echoes guide you toward wisdom and peace.